Welcome back to Proxham, everybody. And today we're going to be going back and talking about Wraithguard again. And we're going to be talking about how to make the most out of your Craftworld Eldar Wraithguard. So Wraithguard are a unit that have gotten a lot of flack recently since the Codex has dropped for not being quite competitive and honestly being a worse variant, a worse alternative to the Wraith Blades. But I actually think that Wraithguard can be good and can be used effectively to great success if you know how to use them correctly and if they have the proper support. So let's go ahead and talk about that today and get right into it. First off, just a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about in this video today. We're going to be looking at the stats, weapons, and special rules of Wraithguard, of course. We're going to be looking at which Craftworlds Wraithguard fit best in. I believe that Craftworld traits are a key part of Wraithguard's success. We're going to be looking at Wraithguard's strength and weaknesses, and we're also going to be looking at the best ways to use each variant of Wraithguard and what they need to be successful. So looking at their base stats here, they're 40 points base, and they have a 5-inch movement, which is kind of the drawback of Wraithguard, is they're very slow moving units, and they're not very fast, so they don't get to where they need to be quick enough in an objective style kind of game. However, they are very tough. They have toughness 6 and 3 wounds apiece. They have a 3+ save and very high leadership, so they're rarely going to fail a morale test if they have to make one. As for their weapons, they have two options. The Descythe is your anti-infantry option, which is a blast weapon. It has 12 inches to its range, strength 10, AP -4, and damage 1. Really great for clearing out infantry units, especially those with the damage profile 1, but can easily trade up into damage or wounds 2 and wounds 3 units as well. The Wraith Cannon, on the other hand, is the same strength AP, but has both more range and more damage, making it way better at taking out heavier targets like tanks and monsters. Both of these weapons cause mortal wounds on 6s to wound as well. As for their special rules, they have the War Construct special rule, which means they can shoot in combat. They can shoot while engaged with the unit they're engaged with. However, the Descythe cannot shoot at all with this because it is a blast weapon, which is why the Descythe is honestly considered one of the poorer choices between the two. There are ways to use the Descythe effectively, but unfortunately it's much harder to do so and requires much more investment. And the ability that they share with all Wraith units is Wraithbone Form. So each time an attack is allocated to the model in this unit, subtract 1 from the damage characteristic of that attack. Makes them a lot more durable against things like damage 3 and even damage 2 weapons. So which Craftworlds do Wraithguard fit best in? So I think there's really 3 options when looking at which Craftworld Wraithguard fit best in. And believe it or not, Iyanden is not one of them. I think Iyanden is good for Wraith units in a lot of ways because of their relic, which is one of the most powerful relics for Wraith units in the game, of course. Well, the most powerful Wraith relic. But all in all, when it comes to Iyanden, they're really better with Wraith Blades. And these Craftworlds are considered the better ones to go with Wraithguard with. They're Eldar, Uthway, and of course the far-flung Craftworlds. So starting with Eldar, they are good for Wraithguard because Wraithguard are normally going to be shooting, and having light and dense cover outside of 12 inches or within terrain features is going to make them much tougher against those types of attacks. So makes them extremely tanky to range fire, and especially combined with things like Protect and Fortune, these guys can be pretty unmovable as far as the shooting game goes. And also, not having their movement modified can really help them kite enemy units into difficult terrain pieces. For example, you could be set up in a piece of difficult terrain. You see an enemy unit that you know is probably going to assault into your Wraithguard the next turn. You can hide within that terrain to slow them down a little bit so that they're taking the negative movement modifiers for moving through it, but you're not, which it can be a common kiting tactic when using shooting units that, you know, might be in danger of getting into close combat. Uthway, on the other hand, does give survivability as well. A little bit different, though, in that instead of getting, light cover and dense cover, they get a 6+ invul save, and they get a 5+ ignores mortal wounds, which is really helpful at keeping them alive, especially against things like mortal spam. So a lot of people like to take out tanky units with mortal wound spam, and this is a great defense against that. So against things like chaos demons, who really like to spam psychic powers to deal mortal wounds, this can be a big defense against that. This is essentially going to be a 5+ save against those attacks. So, for example, a psychic power that normally would do 3 mortal wounds is now only doing 2, which means that a Wraithguard that would have died is still alive as a result of this ability. So, very helpful in keeping your Wraithguard alive. As far as the far-flung Craftworld traits, we have Warden Runs, which basically is the same survivability buff that Uthway gets, but with the option of taking a second trait. So you could take light cover, for example, if you wanted, or you could take something that helps with your movement a little more if you wanted like that. So the far-flung Craftworld traits are also a great way to buff your Wraithguard if you are looking to have a strong Wraithguard presence in your list. Children of the Open Skies is also a very good one, makes them movement 6 and allows them to get across the board quicker with reliable advance rolls, which in the first few turns of the game, if you're not running them in a Wave Serpent or via Webway Strike, they will need this to be able to get into a good position to fire next turn on turn 2. Swift Strikes is another good one that's used very well in combination with Children of the Open Skies, and basically allows Wraithguard to advance and shoot without the hit penalty. So it makes them a little bit more accurate on the move, being able to advance quickly up the field and shoot at the same time at full accuracy. Hunters of the Ancient Relics is something that goes over a lot of people's heads, but I really like this one on Wraithguard because it allows them to shoot and still perform actions. Basically makes them the same as Dire Avengers in that way. It's great on a tough unit that can survive to complete the action. So, to be honest with you, it is good on Dire Avengers, but sometimes it's not that great because Dire Avengers are an easy target to kill. Wraithguard are not. Wraithguard are very tough. So, if you're performing actions with units like Wraithguard, your opponent cannot help but to try to shoot them, right? He can't afford not to because you're going to be scoring victory points every turn and be able to deal damage. So he's going to have to react to you, and at that point, you can use your superior toughness, fortune, protect, those kind of abilities to really make it hard for your opponent to actually kill them, wasting his resources, right? So Hunters of the Ancient Relics, really good on Wraithguard as well. And lastly, this is one that a Laytalk has, which is basically gives them light cover against attacks outside of 12 inches, but it can be combined with other Craftworld traits as you see fit. So you could combine it with things like Children of the Open Skies or Warding Runes to make them extra tough, and basically just customize it however you wish and however you choose to run your Wraithguard. If you want them a little bit faster or if you want them a little bit more tanky, it just depends, but this is a great trait to use as well. So let's go over the strengths and weaknesses of each Wraithguard variant because both variants do inevitably have their strengths and weaknesses. We're going to be looking at the Wraith Cannon variant and the Descythe variant. Now, the Wraith Cannon variant is what most people are going to go with. It's highly considered the better of the two options. Basically, its strengths are that it has an upgraded range. It didn't used to have 18-inch range, now it does in this new codex. And this allows the Wraithguard to be put into a better firing position so they can threaten objectives and tougher units and things like that might be a little bit out of range of 12. They have great damage versus large targets with 3 plus D3 damage and can shoot at enemies they are engaged with, which is not the greatest thing, especially since most enemies aren't going to throw a high-value target into Wraithguard, but it can allow them to get some extra damage if they do find themselves in that situation. Now, as for their weaknesses, they are very easy to tie up in combat with chaff units. Things like Shootaboys or Imperial Guardsmen or Termagants or anything like that will tie these guys up for ages. Even though they have 3 attacks apiece, those attacks are at no AP value and basically, it's just not going to be a great time. You're going to be most likely taking round after round to be able to kill that unit. And also, they are an expensive unit, and they do not do comparable damage to their cost without buffs. So they do need some sort of damage buff to help them along, As for the Descythe, the strengths are they are a blast weapon and they have a lot of attacks, D6 attacks, so they hit extremely hard against infantry of nearly all types, especially if they're in bigger units. I really especially like these guys against demons. I think these guys are one of the best counters to a lot of the demonic units out there just because of the fact that they do have blast and they deal mortal wounds on top of that, so they can get past the demonic save. And on top of that, they're extremely dangerous with buffs or against, again, large units. So things like Guide can really help these guys rip through large units of demons, 10 models or over. I don't think many demon players run big blobs of 20, but even against units of 10, these guys can just shred right through them. The weaknesses of this, however, are that it has a very short range at 12 inches, which leaves them vulnerable to counterattack. And they cannot shoot in close combat because they have the blast keyword, unfortunately, so their War Construct special rule is completely useless with this variant. So you have to be extra careful about getting them in close combat with things. And unfortunately, they are even more expensive than the Wraith Cannon Wraithguard, so it's a little bit harder to make their points value back if you make a mistake and they get engaged with the wrong targets. So that leaves the question, what are the best ways to use each variant of Wraithguard and what do they need to be successful? So as for the Wraith Cannon variant, I think the main thing with making these guys a success is they need a good vantage point in terrain, but not on objectives themselves. So if the objective is in terrain, that's fine, but you typically do not want to just sit them out in the open on an objective and make them a pincushion to enemy shooting. They are durable, but they're not that durable. So place them in a position away from an objective, but one which they have range on it, so that they can help sweep away any heavy targets that want to go in and capture that objective from your other units. They do also need good supporting units that can deal with cheap infantry like cultists, guardsmen, etc. Units like Guardians work well for this because Guardians are fairly cheap and they're good at dealing with targets that, might be considered chaff, or swooping hawks or things like that that can really destroy those units before they can engage with the Wraithguard and tie them up. And in addition, Wraithguard work well when used with defensive buffs like Fortune or Protect. This can make them very hard to move out of positions like that, and your opponent basically at that point either has to continue to take the hits from your Wraithguard or pour an inordinate amount of firepower and focus that unit of Wraithguard down and spend a lot of resources doing it, probably more resources than they would want to spend on killing a unit like this. So as for the Descythe variant, you do need a unit to screen them from combat after they shoot because they are very vulnerable with their range 12. You want to make sure that you have a unit to protect them from close combat afterwards, whether that be a unit of Guardians, whether that be Rangers or whatever. You want to make sure that they do not get into combat. In addition, they also need some sort of damage buff. Guide works best with them in my experience, or maybe even a Spirit Seer's Spirit Mark or the Doom Psychic Power. Also works okay. This is basically to maximize their damage upon arrival because they may only in fact get one chance to shoot. They are a high priority target, and once you eliminate a unit right off the board, something like, a unit of 10 Bloodletters, your opponent is going to want to do everything that they can to kill that unit of Descythes, essentially. So either a Wave Serpent or Webway Strike is also basically needed on these guys to get close to. You do not want these guys to be firing at suboptimal targets because they are too expensive for that. You really don't want to waste them on things like cultists or Imperial Guardsmen, right? And their 12-inch range can hurt them in that way, which is why a Wave Serpent or Webway Strike is an important thing to take with them so that they can get to the juiciest targets in your opponent's army. So a little bit of an example of when and where you want to position your Wraithguard units with the Wraith Cannons to make sure that they're in range of objectives but not quite exposed. So here we have a unit of Wraithguard first turn moving up and advancing into that industrial structure, giving them a little bit of a defensive buff. And remember, that's in addition to whatever other defensive buffs they have. So if they're Craftworld Uthway, they're going to have a 6+ invul and a 5+ ignores mortal wounds. Or if they're a Laytok, they're going to be getting dense cover and light cover from being in that structure. And at the same time, the next turn, you're going to be in range of that enemy objective. So either your opponent has to ignore the objective and stay away from the Wraithguard, which is not really optimal for your opponent, or they have to place something on that objective to essentially be shot at. Now, of course, they could put chaff units on that objective, they could put space marines, but even then, your Wraithguard are going to be accumulating value throughout the game if your opponent does not take care of them. So it kind of puts your opponent into a position where they have to do something about the Wraithguard, and because you have so many defensive buffs stacked up, it's going to be really hard. Well, let me put it this way. It's going to be a very hard unit for your opponent to remove from the table, and they'll probably have to spend more resources than it's worth getting rid of them so that that objective on their side of the board can be a little bit more secure. And of course, you're probably going to have other units in the vicinity that can support the Wraithguard and make it even harder for your opponent to take them out. So if your opponent's going all in for your Wraithguard, there's a lot of ways in which we can counteract that and make it, basically impossible for your opponent to do so easily. Descythes, on the other hand, I have found work best when set up on a flank with screening units like this. So in this scenario, we were either coming through a webway strike or a reserve type situation where we come in, we screen with the unit of Guardians, and then the Wraithguard with Descythes just blow up the unit on the objective. So at this point, yes, your opponent can very well counterattack and kill the Guardians, but they're going to have a hard time getting to the Wraithguard. And the cool thing about this is the Wraithguard can actually shoot again, and then if you basically have the right support elements available, those unit of Wraithguard will be able to basically sweep through entire formations of enemy troops within a couple turns because they do that much damage. The only problem with them is that they're very short range. They're very vulnerable to fast units. Harlequins don't even care about screening units. If you're going against something like Harlequins or Dark Eldar, well, you better hope that they don't have a way to ignore Overwatch because you're going to probably have to spend that command point when they charge in as a last-ditch effort to try to kill their unit before they come in. And actually, the cool thing about these guys is their Overwatch is very powerful, and a lot of people don't really take that into account. But if a unit of 10 is charging into you, you do have the blast keyword. You are getting D6 attacks per, shot. So that's going to be a lot of extra attacks. You do need 6s to hit, but if you're under the effects of something like Guide, which you should be, you're going to be killing a lot of enemy models on charge. And especially if something like Harlequins charges into you, you would be surprised. A lot of Harlequin players are going to take heavy casualties coming into you if they're only trying to take you out with a unit of 5. And they don't have any way of ignoring your Overwatch, which, to be fair, Harlequins do have some ways to ignore Overwatch, so do be aware of that. But let's say they run out of command points or it's late in the game and they don't really have the resources to invest in that kind of thing, then a unit of Wraithguard with Descythes can definitely shred a unit coming in to try to assault them. So in conclusion, even though Wraithguard are not the most competitive unit out there, generally they have a lot of bad matchups. There's a lot of things out there now that can kill them relatively easily with mortal wounds and stuff like that. But in general, I think they can be very effective when used in the right way and with the right support. And if used correctly, Wraithguard of both variants can do much more damage than their points cost would normally suggest. And at the same time, remain very durable for your other forces to anchor around. So they're a very good anchor unit for a flank. They can basically stand the test of time against a lot of small arms fire and things like that. Your opponents really do have to invest much more firepower at killing them than they would other units in your army. So if your opponent is thinking these guys are going to fall to a couple of squads of tactical marines, they will be sorely mistaken. And to be honest with you, they're really going to have to invest a lot of firepower into whatever they use to take that out. They're going to have to use something heavy. And that's when things like dense cover and, strands of fate and things like that come in. Because if you notice your opponent is going hard for your Wraithguard and you're using the Uthway Craftworld trait Warden Runs, you can just save a couple of strands of fate dice on a save, and those heavy attacks that are coming in at you, those plasma cannons or those last cannons or missile launchers or whatever that they're using, those high AP weapons and high strength weapons, you could just use a strands of fate roll on it and completely ignore it. And this can make the unit even tougher and harder to deal with if you notice your opponent is going to be going for them. And just as a side note, I do think Wraithguard can work. I think they're very effective when used with supporting units in their vicinity. They're not a good unit to use by themselves, and I think that's why a lot of players shy away from them, because they're not self-sufficient. They can't do a good job by themselves like something like Wraithblades with Force Shields and Ghost Axes can. They're really more of a unit that needs support. And that, of course, at the competitive level, costs points, right? And there's probably better units to invest things like Guide and Doom and Fortune with. But again, if you do like Wraithguard and you do want them to work, they can be very effective in a list. You just need to kind of plan around them and make sure that they have the right supporting units to be able to make them most effective, to where they can make up their points value and perform roles on the battlefield that are going to win you the game. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. I do have a couple of things coming up this week. I have another video probably coming out Thursday. I'm going to try to get it out. It's on Sudden Assault and when not to use it. That was a example, or a suggestion, I should say, from a subscriber that I really liked. I think Sudden Assault is one of those abilities that can be kind of tricky for newer players to wrap their head around, about when and when not to use it. And we're also going to be having a live stream kind of thing on Friday for about 30 minutes, looking at GW's new balancing system and whether or not that's going to be good for the game going forward. In general, I do think it's on the right track. I think they're doing a good job so far in the early stages, but I do think there needs to be improvements, and there are a couple of points that I would like to make on the live stream in areas that I think GW is overlooking that may be kind of negative for the game in the long run that I hope they improve. So we'll be talking a little bit about that on Friday. All right, everybody, that's going to be it. Peace out. I'll see you guys later, and bring some Wraithguard to your games because they're really good and they're an awesome unit, but they do need support. So give them that love they deserve. All right, everybody. See you later. Have a good one.